Most people think mental strength means never feeling stress, never feeling doubt, never experiencing fear or frustration, or the heavy weight of uncertainty that settles over the mind when life becomes difficult. There is an image of the mentally strong person that floats through culture, and it is almost always the same. Someone who never flinches. Someone who remains unmoved in the face of anything. Someone who appears to feel nothing when pressure builds, when circumstances collapse, when the ground beneath them shifts without warning. But that image is misleading. It describes something closer to numbness than strength, and the distinction matters because when people measure themselves against an ideal that does not actually exist, they almost always conclude that they are falling short. They feel stress and interpret it as weakness. They feel doubt and interpret it as failure. They feel overwhelmed and assume that a stronger person would not feel that way at all. The truth is quieter and less dramatic. Even the strongest individuals experience uncertainty. They experience frustration. They feel the pull of anxiety when the outcome of a situation is unknown. They feel anger when they are treated unfairly. They feel the sting of failure when something they worked hard on does not produce the result they expected. They feel all of it. The full range of internal pressure that comes with being alive in a world that does not always cooperate with plans. So what actually separates mentally strong people from everyone else? It is not the absence of difficulty. It is not the absence of emotion. And it is certainly not some inborn trait that makes certain people immune to the struggles that affect everyone else. The difference is often not what they experience. It is how they respond, how they behave in the gap between what happens to them and what they do next, how they manage the space between feeling something and acting on it. That space, small as it often is where mental strength lives. A person who feels anger and immediately lashes out has not demonstrated strength. A person who feels fear and immediately retreats has not demonstrated strength. But a person who feels anger and pauses, who feels fear and continues forward anyway, who feels doubt and still makes a clear decision, that person is exercising something that most people never think to practice. And it is in that exercise, repeated over hundreds of small moments across the ordinary days of a life, that genuine mental strength develops. This is not about suppressing emotion. It is not about pretending that feelings do not exist or pushing them down until they disappear. Suppression is its own form of weakness because it requires constant energy and eventually fails. What is being described here is different. It is the ability to feel what is happening internally while still maintaining control over what happens externally, to experience the full force of an emotion without allowing that emotion to dictate the next action, to remain the one making decisions, even when the feelings are loud. When a person learns to control their reactions, to think clearly during pressure, and to remain steady when circumstances become difficult, mental strength begins to develop. Not overnight, not in a single dramatic moment of decision, but gradually through the accumulation of small choices that most people never notice. Choices made in traffic, choices made during disagreements, choices made when the news is bad, when the results are disappointing, when someone says something that cuts deep. Those are the moments where the mind is either trained toward strength or allowed to drift toward reactivity. And over time, the direction of that drift determines the kind of person someone becomes. This is not about becoming emotionless. It is about becoming deliberate. It is about developing the internal discipline to choose a response rather than being chosen by a reaction. And that discipline, while it may sound simple in description, is among the most powerful capacities a human being can develop. One of the most immediate ways that mental strength shows itself is in the relationship between emotional reactions and decision-making. Most people do not realize how heavily their decisions are influenced by their current emotional state. When someone is angry, the decisions they make tend to reflect that anger. When someone is afraid, their choices narrow around the fear. When someone is frustrated, impatient, or anxious, the decisions that emerge from those states carry the imprint of those feelings, often in ways that create more difficulty than the original situation warranted. This is not obvious in the moment. In the moment, a decision driven by emotion feels justified. It feels necessary. It feels like the only reasonable course of action given the circumstances. But when the emotion passes, when calm returns, the same decision often looks different. It looks reactive, disproportionate. Sometimes it looks like a mistake, and the person is left dealing not only with the original problem, but with the consequences of a response that was shaped more by feeling than by clear thought. This pattern plays out constantly in relationships where words spoken in anger cannot be taken back, in professional settings where impulsive responses to criticism create unnecessary conflict, in personal decisions where fear or frustration leads to choices that serve the emotion of the moment rather than the long-term well-being of the individual. Mentally strong individuals are not immune to this pattern, but they have learned to recognize it. They have developed the habit of pausing before acting when emotions are running high. Not because the emotions are wrong, but because acting from within the peak of an emotion rarely produces the clearest or most effective response. This pause is not dramatic. It is not a long meditation or a complicated internal process. It is simply a brief moment of hesitation, a moment in which the person recognizes that they are feeling something strongly and that this might not be the ideal time to make a permanent decision, a moment in which the urge to react is noticed but not immediately followed, and in that moment, however brief, clarity has a chance to emerge. This habit, the habit of pausing before responding to difficult situations, is one of the most underestimated forms of strength. It does not look impressive from the outside. It does not generate admiration or attention, but it prevents an enormous amount of unnecessary damage. It preserves relationships that would otherwise be harmed by impulsive words. It protects careers that would otherwise be derailed by reactive decisions. It maintains stability in circumstances that would otherwise spiral into chaos because someone could not wait 30 seconds before speaking or acting. And like any habit, it develops through repetition. The first time someone manages to pause in the middle of a strong emotion and choose a measured response instead of an impulsive one, it is difficult. It requires real effort. The pull of the emotion is strong, and the urge to act immediately feels overwhelming. But each time the pause is practiced, it becomes slightly easier. The space between stimulus and response grows a little wider. The ability to sit with discomfort without immediately trying to discharge it through action becomes a little more stable. And over time, what was once nearly impossible becomes something closer to a default. This is how mental strength is built. Not in a single defining moment, but through the gradual expansion of that internal space. The space where choices live. The space where clarity can exist even in the presence of strong emotion. And the wider that space becomes, the more freedom a person has to respond to life deliberately rather than reactively. There is another dimension to this that most people rarely consider, and it involves the relationship between thoughts and belief. Most people live inside their thoughts without questioning them. A thought appears in the mind, and it is accepted as true almost automatically. There is no examination, no evaluation, no moment of asking whether this thought is accurate, helpful, or even relevant. It simply appears, and it is believed. This is understandable. Thoughts feel like they come from within, and because they come from within, they carry an inherent sense of authority. If my own mind is telling me something, it must be true. If I think I am not good enough, then I must not be good enough. If I think this situation is hopeless, then it must be hopeless. If I think someone is against me, then they must be against me. The thought and the truth become the same thing, but they are not the same thing. Thoughts are not facts. They are mental events shaped by mood, by fatigue, by past experience, by habit. by the chemicals moving through the body at any given moment. A thought that arises during a period of exhaustion may look very different from a thought that arises during a period of rest. A thought that appears after a failure may carry a bleakness that has more to do with the emotional residue of the failure than with any objective assessment of reality. A thought that surfaces during conflict may be distorted by anger or defensiveness in ways that are invisible in the moment but obvious in retrospect. Learning to observe thoughts instead of immediately believing them is one of the most important disciplines in developing mental strength. It does not mean dismissing every thought as untrue. Some thoughts are accurate and useful. But it means developing the ability to notice a thought, to hold it at a slight distance, and to evaluate it before accepting it as the basis for action or belief. This looks simple on the surface, but in practice, it changes the internal landscape significantly. When a thought appears that says, "This is never going to work," a person who automatically believes that thought will feel discouraged and may stop trying. A person who observes the thought, who recognizes it as a product of the current emotional state rather than an absolute truth, can acknowledge the feeling without being controlled by it. They can continue forward despite the thought, not because they are ignoring it, but because they have assessed it and decided not to give it authority over their behavior. This capacity grows with practice. At first, it is difficult to catch thoughts in real time. They move quickly, and the habit of believing them is deeply ingrained. But over time, with repeated attention, the ability to notice thoughts as they arise becomes more natural. The automatic belief begins to loosen, and in its place, a more flexible, more discerning relationship with one's own thinking begins to develop. This is not about controlling every thought. That is neither possible nor desirable. Thoughts will continue to arise, many of them unbidden, many of them unhelpful. The goal is not to eliminate them, but to change the relationship with them. To move from a position of automatic obedience to a position of quiet observation. To become someone who has thoughts rather than someone who is had by them. And this shift in relationship has direct consequences for mental strength, because much of what makes difficult situations feel overwhelming is not the situation itself, but the narrative that the mind constructs around it. The situation is one thing. The interpretation of the situation is another. And often, it is the interpretation that creates the majority of the suffering. A criticism from a colleague is one thing. The thought that follows, saying they do not respect me and never have, is another. A financial setback is one thing. The thought that follows, saying, I will never recover from this, is another. A disagreement with someone close is one thing. The thought that follows, saying, this relationship is falling apart, is another. In each case, the event is manageable, but the thought that follows the event can turn a manageable situation into a crisis. When the ability to observe thoughts develops, these escalations become visible before they take hold. The thought is seen for what it is, an interpretation, a projection, a habit of mind, and in being seen, it loses some of its power, not all of it, but enough to create room for a different response. A response that is based on the actual situation rather than on the story the mind has built around it. This brings another important pattern into focus, and it involves how a person responds when facing criticism or setbacks. These are among the most revealing moments in the development of mental strength, because they expose the habits that operate beneath the surface of everyday composure. When things are going well, almost anyone can appear calm and confident. Composure during favorable circumstances is not particularly difficult. But when criticism arrives, when someone questions the quality of work, challenges a decision, or expresses disapproval, the internal response is often immediate and intense. Defensiveness rises. The urge to justify, to explain, to counterattack, to dismiss the critic, all of these reactions appear almost instantly. And when a setback occurs, when a plan fails, when an effort does not produce the expected result, When something that was relied upon falls through, the internal reaction can be equally intense. Disappointment, self-blame, frustration directed inward or outward, the temptation to give up entirely or to make a dramatic change in direction based not on clear thinking, but on the emotional impact of the failure. Mentally strong individuals feel these same reactions. The difference is that they do not allow the reactions to run the show. They feel the defensiveness that comes with criticism, but they pause before responding. They consider whether there is something useful in the feedback. They evaluate it on its merits rather than dismissing it because it is uncomfortable. They do not enjoy being criticized, but they recognize that automatic defensiveness often prevents them from hearing information that could be genuinely valuable. Similarly, when facing setbacks, they feel the disappointment fully, but they do not allow the disappointment to become the final word. They take time to understand what happened. They look at the situation clearly, without the distortions of self-pity or blame. They ask what can be learned, what can be adjusted, what remains within their control, and then they move forward, not with dramatic resolve or exaggerated determination, but with steady, quiet continuation. This kind of response does not come naturally to most people. It has to be developed, and it is developed through the repeated decision to respond rather than react, to evaluate rather than defend, to learn rather than blame. Each time this decision is made, even when it is difficult, especially when it is difficult, the internal capacity for resilience grows a little stronger. The habit of reactivity weakens, and the habit of measured, deliberate response begins to take its place. And within this process, something important is often discovered. The discomfort that comes with criticism, with failure, with setbacks, is not as dangerous as it feels. It is uncomfortable, certainly. It is unpleasant, but it is not destructive in the way the mind often suggests. The thought that says, "This is unbearable," is almost always an exaggeration. The reality is that the discomfort can be tolerated, it can be sat with, it can be endured without catastrophe, and on the other side of it, there is often something valuable. A clearer perspective, a stronger resolve, a more realistic understanding of the situation. Understanding that discomfort is a natural part of growth is one of the quieter foundations of mental strength. Most people try to avoid discomfort whenever possible. They arrange their lives around the minimization of unpleasant feelings. And to some extent, this is reasonable. There is no virtue in seeking out unnecessary suffering. But when the avoidance of discomfort becomes the primary organizing principle of a life, it creates a fragility that undermines resilience. Because growth, by its nature, involves discomfort. Learning something new involves the discomfort of not yet being competent. Building a skill involves the discomfort of repeated failure before mastery develops. Changing a habit involves the discomfort of acting against established patterns. Having a difficult conversation involves the discomfort of vulnerability and potential conflict. In every case, the path towards something better passes through a period of something harder. And if discomfort is treated as something to be avoided at all costs, the path is never taken. Mentally strong individuals do not seek out discomfort for its own sake, but they do not flee from it either. They recognize it as a signal, not necessarily a signal to stop, but often a signal that something meaningful is happening, that they are at the edge of their current capacity, that they are being asked to stretch beyond what is familiar. And while the stretching is uncomfortable, it is also where growth occurs. This is not a comfortable idea. It does not promise ease or pleasure, but it is honest. And there is a kind of strength that comes from honesty alone, from facing what is true about the nature of growth and difficulty, rather than pretending that the ideal life is one in which nothing is ever hard. Choosing disciplined responses instead of impulsive reactions is closely connected to this willingness to sit with discomfort, because the urge to react impulsively is, at its core, an attempt to escape discomfort as quickly as possible. When someone feels the sharp edge of frustration or the heavy weight of disappointment, the impulse to do something, anything, is often driven not by the desire for a good outcome, but by the desire to make the feeling stop. Lashing out at someone who has provoked anger makes the anger feel momentarily satisfied. Making a dramatic decision in the heat of frustration gives the illusion of control. Withdrawing from a situation that feels threatening provides immediate relief from the fear. In every case, the impulsive reaction serves the short-term emotional need, but it rarely serves the longer-term interest. And more often than not, it creates additional problems that require their own set of responses. Disciplined response is different. It involves tolerating the discomfort long enough to choose an action based on clarity rather than urgency. It involves recognizing that the desire to make the feeling stop is not the same as the need to act right now. It involves sitting with the frustration, the fear, the disappointment, the anger, and allowing it to be present without needing to convert it immediately into behavior. This is difficult, genuinely difficult. The pull toward immediate action during emotional intensity is powerful. But each time it is resisted, each time a person chooses to wait, to think, to evaluate before acting, the capacity for discipline grows. The internal muscles that hold a person steady during turbulence become a little stronger, and the pattern begins to shift from reactive to deliberate. And this deliberateness extends naturally to how a person relates to uncertainty. Most people experience uncertainty as a threat. An unknown outcome feels dangerous, not because it is necessarily bad, but because it is uncontrolled. The mind does not like gaps in the story. It does not like not knowing what will happen next. And so it fills the gaps with projections, usually negative ones, creating a sense of danger that may or may not correspond to reality. Accepting uncertainty without losing stability is one of the hallmarks of a strong mind. It does not mean being comfortable with not knowing. It means being able to function despite not knowing. It means continuing to act, to plan, to make decisions, even when the outcome is unclear. It means recognizing that certainty, true certainty, is rare in life. That most decisions are made with incomplete information. That most plans unfold in ways that differ from the original expectation. And that waiting for certainty before acting often means never acting at all. The person who can tolerate uncertainty does not have less fear than the person who cannot. They simply have a different relationship with their fear. They feel it. They acknowledge it. But they do not allow it to freeze them. They do not allow the absence of certainty to become an excuse for inaction, and they do not allow the projections of the mind, the worst-case scenarios, the imagined disasters, to replace the actual reality of the present moment. This is an important distinction. The mind's projections about the future are not the future. They are thoughts, mental constructions, and while some of those projections may turn out to be accurate, many of them will not. Treating every worried thought as a prediction is not caution. It is a form of reactivity. It is allowing the mind's habit of generating worst-case scenarios to determine behavior, and that habit, left unchecked, will shrink the scope of a life far more effectively than any actual threat. Maintaining focus during stressful periods is closely related to this capacity. When stress increases, attention tends to scatter. The mind jumps between worries, between tasks, between potential problems, without settling on any one long enough to address it effectively. There is a feeling of urgency that makes everything seem equally important and equally pressing, and the result is not increased productivity or problem solving but increased agitation. More movement, less progress. More noise, less clarity. The mentally strong individual is not immune to this scattering effect, but they have developed the ability to recognize when it is happening and to deliberately redirect attention toward what is most important. Not everything at once, not the entire list of worries and responsibilities and potential threats, but the single thing that can be addressed right now. The next clear action, the immediate priority. This kind of focus does not eliminate stress, but it prevents stress from becoming chaos. It channels the energy of anxiety into productive action rather than allowing it to dissipate into scattered worry. And each time this redirection is practiced, the ability to maintain focus under pressure becomes a little more reliable. There is something related to this that often goes unrecognized, and it involves the development of patience during periods of slow progress. Most people have a complicated relationship with patience. They understand it conceptually. They know it is supposed to be a virtue. But in practice, when results are not appearing as quickly as expected, patience is one of the first things to be abandoned. The desire for quick results is natural. When effort has been invested, the expectation of return feels justified. And when that return does not appear on the expected timeline, frustration builds. The mind begins to question whether the effort was worthwhile, whether the approach is correct, whether the goal is achievable. And in many cases, the frustration becomes strong enough that the effort is abandoned entirely, not because it was failing, but because the pace of progress was not satisfying the emotional need for confirmation. But most meaningful development, whether it involves a skill, a relationship, a career, or a personal quality, does not unfold on a dramatic timeline. It unfolds slowly, incrementally, in ways that are often invisible from day to day. The improvement from one week to the next may be too small to measure. The difference between 1 month and the next may be undetectable. And yet, over longer periods, the accumulation of these small, invisible changes produces something significant. Patience, in this context, is not passive waiting. It is active continuation in the absence of visible results. It is the willingness to keep doing what needs to be done, even when the evidence of progress is not yet apparent. And it requires a particular kind of mental strength, because the emotional pressure to see results, to feel rewarded, to receive confirmation that the effort is working, is constant and powerful. The person who can maintain effort during periods of slow or invisible progress is demonstrating one of the most practical forms of mental strength. They are choosing discipline over gratification. They are choosing persistence over the emotional relief that comes with quitting. And they are trusting, not blindly but based on a reasonable assessment of the situation, that the results will eventually appear if the effort is sustained. This is not always the right choice. Sometimes progress is slow because the approach is wrong and adjustment is needed. Patience should not become stubbornness, but the ability to distinguish between the two, to know when patience is warranted and when a change of approach is needed, is itself a product of clear thinking and emotional discipline. It requires the ability to evaluate the situation honestly, without the distortion of impatience or the influence of frustrated emotions, and that ability develops through the same habits that build mental strength in other areas: pausing, observing, thinking clearly, choosing a response rather than following a reaction. Another pattern that quietly shapes mental strength is the relationship with approval. Most people, whether they recognize it or not, carry a significant desire to be approved of by others, to be liked, to be respected, to be seen as competent, successful, interesting, or admirable. This desire is natural, it is deeply rooted, and it serves an important social function. But when it becomes the primary driver of behavior, it creates a dependency that undermines resilience. When a person's sense of stability depends on receiving consistent approval from others, every interaction becomes a test. Every conversation carries the risk of disapproval. Every decision must be filtered through the question of how others will perceive it. And the result is a life that is shaped not by the person's own values, judgment, or priorities, but by the anticipated reactions of other people. This is exhausting. It is also fragile, because other people's approval is never fully within one's control. People approve and disapprove for reasons that are often invisible, sometimes irrational, and always changing. Building a sense of stability on something this unpredictable is like building a structure on shifting ground. It may hold for a while, but it is always at risk of collapse. Letting go of the need for constant approval does not mean becoming indifferent to others. It does not mean ignoring feedback or refusing to consider other perspectives. It means developing a center of gravity that is internal rather than external. It means knowing one's own values well enough to act from them, even when those actions do not receive unanimous support. It means being willing to make decisions that feel right, based on careful thought and honest self-assessment, even when those decisions might be questioned or criticized by others. This is not easy. The desire for approval is deeply ingrained, and acting against it produces its own kind of discomfort. But each time a person makes a decision based on their own judgment rather than on the anticipated reaction of others, their internal stability grows a little stronger. They become a little less dependent on external validation, a little more confident in their own capacity to evaluate and decide. And over time, this independence becomes a significant source of resilience. This does not mean isolation. Strong individuals still value connection, still seek feedback, still care about the people around them, but their sense of self is not entirely dependent on what those people think of them. They can receive criticism without crumbling. They can face disapproval without abandoning their position. They can exist in a room where not everyone agrees with them without feeling that their identity is under threat. And this connects directly to how mental strength operates during conflict or disagreement. Conflict is one of the most challenging environments for maintaining self-control. When someone disagrees strongly, when voices rise, when positions become entrenched, the emotional intensity can escalate quickly. And in that escalation, the habits that normally keep behavior in check often break down. Maintaining self-control during conflict does not mean suppressing all emotion. It does not mean remaining silent or passive. It means staying connected to clarity even when the emotional temperature rises. It means speaking with intention rather than impulse. It means listening even when it is difficult to hear what the other person is saying. And it means being willing to disagree firmly without losing composure or resorting to behavior that will be regretted later. This is one of the most difficult applications of mental strength because conflict engages some of the most powerful emotional responses. The desire to be right, the desire to be heard, the desire to win, the feeling of being attacked or misunderstood. All of these are intense, and all of them push toward reactivity. But the person who can maintain discipline in these moments, who can hold their position without losing control, who can express disagreement without hostility, demonstrates a kind of strength that is both rare and deeply effective. And the effects extend beyond the conflict itself. When a person consistently handles disagreements with composure, the people around them begin to trust that composure. Conversations become more honest because there is less fear of escalation. Relationships become more resilient because both parties know that disagreement will not destroy the connection. And the individual themselves becomes more confident, not because they always win arguments, but because they know they can navigate them without losing themselves in the process. Mental strength grows through repeated small moments of restraint. This is a point that cannot be overstated. The common image of strength involves large, dramatic displays. Standing firm during a crisis, making a bold decision under extreme pressure, enduring something extraordinary with visible courage. And while these moments do exist, they are rare. They make up a tiny fraction of a life. The vast majority of mental strength is developed and demonstrated in moments that no one notices. The moment when someone receives a critical email and waits an hour before responding. The moment when someone is cut off in traffic and chooses not to escalate. The moment when someone hears gossip about themselves and decides not to engage. The moment when someone feels the urge to say something hurtful during an argument and holds back. The moment when someone is tired, frustrated, and overwhelmed, and instead of making a significant decision in that state, they choose to wait until morning. These are small moments. They do not appear in any dramatic narrative. They are not witnessed by an audience. But they are the actual building blocks of mental strength. Each one is a repetition, a practice, a slight strengthening of the internal capacity to choose rather than react. And over time, these repetitions accumulate. The pattern shifts. The default setting moves from reactive to deliberate. And what was once difficult, pausing in the middle of an emotional surge, becomes something closer to a reflex. This is how habits form, not through a single decision, but through repeated action. And the habit of restraint, the habit of pausing, the habit of choosing clarity over impulse is no different. It forms through practice, through the unglamorous, invisible, daily exercise of self-control in situations that seem too small to matter. But they do matter. They matter because they are the situations that make up the overwhelming majority of life. The big moments may define a narrative, but the small moments define a character. And character, in the end, is what mental strength looks like when it is lived rather than performed. Learning to tolerate frustration without losing clarity is another practical expression of this kind of strength. Frustration is one of the most common and most underestimated emotional experiences. It arises whenever there is a gap between what is expected and what occurs. When a task takes longer than anticipated, when a plan encounters an obstacle, when someone does not respond as expected, when progress stalls, when effort does not produce the expected reward. Frustration is uncomfortable but not dangerous. In itself, it is simply a signal that something is not going as planned. But when frustration is not tolerated well, it distorts everything around it. Thinking becomes narrower, options seem fewer, problems seem larger. The ability to see alternatives or to identify solutions decreases because the emotional noise of the frustration is drowning out clearer signals. The person who can tolerate frustration, who can feel it without being hijacked by it, retains access to their full cognitive capacity even during difficult moments. They can still think clearly. They can still evaluate options. They can still see the situation for what it is rather than what frustration is making it appear to be. And this clarity, maintained in the presence of discomfort, is one of the most practical advantages that mental strength provides. It is not about enjoying frustration. It is not about pretending it does not exist. It is about developing enough internal stability to feel frustrated and still function effectively. To feel the urge to quit and continue anyway. To feel the desire to lash out and remain composed. To feel the temptation to abandon the effort and instead take a breath, reassess, and decide what to do next with a clear mind. This kind of tolerance develops the same way that other aspects of mental strength develop, through practice, through the repeated experience of feeling frustration and choosing not to be governed by it, through the gradual discovery that the feeling, while unpleasant, is survivable, that it passes, that it does not have to dictate behavior, and that on the other side of it, clarity is still available. Developing resilience through reflection and self-awareness is another quiet but significant aspect of mental strength that many people overlook. Reflection, in this context, does not mean rumination. Rumination is the repeated cycling over problems, mistakes, and worries without any forward movement. It is a loop that generates distress without producing insight. Reflection is different. It is the deliberate, calm examination of experience for the purpose of understanding. When a difficult situation has passed, reflection allows a person to look back at it without the intensity of the emotions that were present in the moment. It allows for questions that could not be asked during the event itself. What happened? How did I respond? Was that response effective? What drove my reaction? Was it based on the actual situation, or was it amplified by assumptions, past experiences, or emotional habits? What would I do differently if this happened again? These questions are not comfortable. They require honesty. They require the willingness to see one's own behavior clearly, without the protective filter of justification or blame. but they produce something valuable. They produce understanding. And understanding, over time, produces change, not sudden change, not dramatic transformation, but gradual adjustment, the slow refinement of responses, the quiet correction of habits that are not serving the person well. Self-awareness is the foundation of this process. Without it, the same patterns repeat endlessly. The same reactive behaviors emerge in response to the same triggers. The same mistakes are made under the same circumstances, and because the person is not aware of the pattern, they cannot interrupt it. They are locked into a cycle that they cannot see. But when self-awareness develops, the cycle becomes visible, the trigger is recognized, the emotional response is noticed, the habitual behavior is seen for what it is, not as the only possible response, but as one option among several, and in that recognition, the possibility of a different response opens up. Not effortlessly, not automatically, but as a genuine option, a choice, and the exercise of that choice, repeated over time, is what builds the kind of resilience that endures. Remaining steady when circumstances change unexpectedly is a closely related capacity. Life is fundamentally unpredictable. Plans fail, expectations are violated, conditions shift without warning, and the ability to remain functional, clear-headed, and stable during these shifts is one of the most practical expressions of mental strength. When circumstances change suddenly, the initial reaction is almost always some form of disorientation. The mental map that was being used to navigate the situation no longer matches the territory. The assumptions that were guiding decisions are no longer valid. And in that gap between the old understanding and the new reality, there is a moment of vulnerability, a moment in which the mind is searching for solid ground and not finding it. Most people experience this moment as deeply unsettling, and the temptation is to grab for the first available response, whether or not it is the right one, to do something, anything, to restore the feeling of control. But this urgency often leads to poor decisions. Decisions made in the disorientation of the initial shock. Decisions that feel necessary in the moment, but prove to be premature or misdirected when viewed from a calmer perspective. The person who can tolerate that moment of disorientation, who can sit in the gap without panicking, who can allow the new reality to settle before responding, is in a significantly better position. They do not waste energy on premature action. They do not compound the problem with a reactive decision. They give themselves the time needed to understand what has actually changed, what the new circumstances require, and what the most effective next step would be. This is not passivity. It is disciplined restraint. It is the recognition that the urge to act immediately during a sudden change is usually driven by the discomfort of uncertainty rather than by the actual demands of the situation. And it is the willingness to tolerate the discomfort long enough to make a choice that is based on reality rather than on the need to make the feeling stop. Over time, this capacity becomes increasingly reliable. Each experience of unexpected change, navigated with some degree of composure, builds confidence in the ability to handle the next one. Not confidence in the sense of arrogance or invulnerability, but confidence in the sense of a quiet, earned trust in one's own ability to remain functional when the ground shifts. That trust is one of the most valuable products of mental strength, because it reduces the anticipatory anxiety that so often accompanies the mere possibility of change. When a person knows, from direct experience, that they can handle disruption, the fear of disruption decreases, not to zero, but enough to allow for a more open, more flexible, more resilient approach to life. Building confidence through disciplined responses rather than emotional reactions is another important pattern that develops gradually over the life of a mentally strong individual. There is a common misconception that confidence comes from success, that the more things go well, the more confident a person becomes, and while success certainly contributes to confidence, this equation misses something crucial. Confidence that is based solely on success is fragile. It depends on external outcomes. It rises when things go well and collapses when they do not. It creates a relationship with confidence that is entirely conditional. I feel confident when I am winning. I feel shattered when I am losing. And since no one wins all the time, this kind of confidence is perpetually unstable. A more durable form of confidence comes not from the outcome itself, but from the knowledge that one can handle the outcome, whatever it may be. This kind of confidence is built through the repeated experience of responding to difficult situations with discipline and composure. Each time a setback is navigated without collapse. Each time a criticism is received without defensiveness taking over. Each time a failure is processed without spiraling into self-destruction. Each of these experiences deposits a small amount of confidence that is not tied to the outcome but to the response. And over time, these deposits accumulate into something stable. This kind of confidence does not announce itself loudly. It does not boast or display itself. It is quiet, internal. It shows up as a steady presence during difficulty, as a willingness to engage with challenges rather than avoiding them, as a calm assurance that whatever happens, the response will be managed. Not perfectly, not without difficulty, but managed. And that is enough. This is fundamentally different from the confidence that is projected outward for the benefit of others. That kind of confidence is a performance. It may or may not correspond to what is happening inside. But the confidence that is built through disciplined response to real challenges is not a performance. It is a product of experience, a result of evidence gathered over time, evidence that says, I have been in difficult situations before. I have felt pressure before. I have been uncertain, afraid, frustrated, and overwhelmed before, and I have managed. I have continued. I have come through, not unscathed, but intact. That evidence, accumulated through real experience rather than through self-talk or affirmation, creates a foundation that does not shift easily. It holds steady during new challenges because it is based on actual history rather than hopeful thinking. And it grows stronger with each new challenge navigated, not because the challenges themselves become easier, but because the track record of managing them becomes longer and more convincing. There is a quieter dimension of mental strength that is rarely discussed, and it involves the way a person relates to their own internal experience over time. Most people develop certain habits of self-talk, ways of speaking to themselves internally, that they are barely aware of but that have a significant impact on how they experience life. Some people carry a constant internal critic, a voice that evaluates everything they do and finds it lacking, that interprets mistakes as confirmations of inadequacy, that takes any setback and uses it as evidence that the person is not good enough, not smart enough, not disciplined enough. This voice often sounds like truth, because it has been present for so long that it has become part of the mental landscape. But it is not truth. It is habit, a pattern of self-evaluation that was likely developed long ago and has been running on autopilot ever since. Mentally strong individuals are not free from this voice, but they have learned to recognize it. They have developed the ability to hear the internal critic without accepting its assessments as final. They can notice the thought that says, "You failed again. This proves you are not capable," and rather than collapsing under the weight of that thought, they can evaluate it. Is that accurate? Does this single failure really prove what the thought claims it proves? Or is the thought an exaggeration, shaped by an old habit of self-criticism rather than by a fair assessment of the current situation? This evaluation is not always easy. The internal critic often has a voice that sounds authoritative and certain. But the very act of questioning it, of holding it up to examination rather than accepting it automatically, weakens its grip. Over time, the relationship with self-talk shifts. The critic does not disappear, but it becomes one voice among several rather than the only voice in the room. And the person becomes more capable of choosing which voice to listen to, which thought to accept, and which to let pass without engagement. This internal shift contributes directly to mental strength, because so much of what makes people fragile is not external pressure, but internal amplification of that pressure. The situation provides one level of difficulty. The mind's interpretation of the situation often multiplies that difficulty several times over. And when the interpretation can be moderated, when the amplification can be reduced, the actual difficulty becomes more manageable. Not easy, but manageable. There is something else that quietly contributes to the development of mental strength, and it is the willingness to continue functioning in the absence of motivation. Most people believe that action requires motivation. That before they can do something difficult, they need to feel motivated to do it. That the feeling comes first and the action follows, but this sequence is often reversed. In many cases, motivation does not precede action. It follows it. The feeling of motivation appears after engagement has begun, not before. And waiting for motivation to arrive before taking action often means waiting indefinitely, because motivation is not a reliable visitor. It comes and goes according to its own schedule, influenced by mood, energy, sleep, health, and a dozen other factors that are never fully within conscious control. The mentally strong individual recognizes this and does not wait for motivation to begin. They act despite the absence of motivation. They do what needs to be done because it needs to be done, regardless of whether the feeling is present. And in doing so, they often find that the feeling appears along the way. That engagement itself generates the energy that motivation was supposed to provide. That starting is the hardest part, and once the start has been made, continuation becomes easier. This is not about grinding through life without any pleasure or engagement. It is about recognizing that discipline is the bridge between desire and accomplishment. That discipline is what carries a person through the periods when motivation is absent, when the work feels tedious, when the results are not yet visible, when the emotional reward of effort has not yet arrived. And that discipline, practiced consistently, eventually produces its own kind of satisfaction, a quiet sense of reliability, of self-trust, of knowing that one will follow through, not because it feels good, but because it is what was decided. And this reliability extends to how a person relates to commitments, to promises made to themselves and to others. Each time a commitment is honored, especially when it would be easier not to, the internal sense of trustworthiness grows. The person begins to take their own word more seriously. They begin to believe, based on evidence, that when they decide to do something, they will do it. And this belief, this earned self-trust, is one of the most powerful forms of mental strength available. It does not come from outside. It is not given by others. It is built, one kept commitment at a time, through the quiet, unremarkable discipline of doing what was said would be done. There is another pattern that merits attention, and it involves the way a person relates to the behavior and reactions of other people. Much of the emotional turbulence that people experience in daily life comes not from their own actions or choices, but from the actions and choices of others. Someone is rude. Someone is dismissive. Someone fails to acknowledge effort. Someone acts in a way that feels unfair or unkind. These experiences are common and genuinely unpleasant, but the degree to which they affect a person's internal state varies enormously depending on the mental habits they have developed. A person who has not developed mental strength may find their entire day ruined by a single negative interaction. The rudeness of a stranger, the insensitivity of a colleague, the perceived slight from someone close. Each of these can trigger a cascade of negative emotion that far exceeds the significance of the event itself. A person who has developed some degree of mental strength still feels the sting of these interactions, but they are better able to contain the impact. They can recognize that the behavior of others is often a reflection of the other person's internal state, not a statement about their own worth. They can process the discomfort without letting it contaminate the rest of the day. They can choose how much weight to give to the interaction rather than having the weight imposed on them automatically. This is not about excusing bad behavior or pretending that unkindness does not matter. It is about recognizing that the only behavior a person can fully control is their own, and that allowing the behavior of others to determine one's internal state is a form of giving away control that a mentally strong individual learns to reclaim. This reclamation is not total. No one is entirely immune to the impact of others, but the degree of influence can be reduced through awareness. Through the recognition that a reaction to someone else's behavior is still a reaction and that it can be observed, evaluated, and moderated just like any other reaction. And through the quiet, repeated practice of returning attention to one's own choices, one's own priorities, one's own responses, rather than remaining fixated on what someone else said or did. There is a cumulative quality to all of these patterns. No single one of them, taken in isolation, constitutes mental strength, but taken together, practiced consistently, reinforced through the quiet repetition of daily life, they form something substantial, something durable, something that can hold steady when pressure increases, when circumstances change, when emotions run high, when the path forward is unclear. And this is perhaps the most important thing to understand about mental strength. It is not a talent. It is not a gift. It is not something that certain people are born with and others are not. It is a product of habit, of attention, of repeated small choices that gradually reshape the internal landscape. Anyone can develop it, not equally, not in the same way, not on the same timeline, but genuinely, through practice, through awareness, through the disciplined, patient, daily work of choosing how to respond to whatever life presents. The people who demonstrate the most consistent mental strength over time are not superhuman. They are not fundamentally different from anyone else in their emotional makeup or their vulnerability to difficulty. They are simply people who have practiced, who have paid attention, who have made the small, invisible choices over and over in the quiet moments that no one sees. And those choices, accumulated across years, have built something that holds. Mental strength is not built in dramatic moments. It is not forged in a single crisis or developed through a single peak experience. It develops gradually through how a person responds to everyday challenges, through the quality of their reactions, through the steadiness of their attention, through the patience of their effort, through the discipline of their choices. Mentally strong individuals often share quiet patterns that are easy to overlook. They pause before reacting. They think before speaking. They remain steady even when situations become difficult. They tolerate uncertainty without panic. They accept discomfort without being destroyed by it. They maintain their standards even when no one is watching. They honor their commitments even when motivation is absent. They evaluate their own behavior honestly, without the protection of excuses or the distortion of self-pity. These are not dramatic qualities. They do not attract attention or generate applause, but they are the qualities that create a life of stability, reliability, and quiet confidence. A life that can withstand pressure, not because it avoids difficulty, but because it has developed the capacity to move through difficulty without being broken by it. Most people wait for life to become easier before they feel strong. They imagine that strength will arrive when the circumstances improve, when the job becomes less stressful, when the relationship becomes more supportive, when the finances become more secure, when the body becomes healthier. They place the feeling of strength on the other side of a condition that has not yet been met, and so they wait. But strength rarely comes from easy circumstances. Easy circumstances require very little from the mind. They do not test. They do not challenge. They do not demand the kind of deliberate, disciplined response that builds internal capacity. Strength develops when life is hard, when the situation is uncomfortable, when the outcome is uncertain, when the emotions are strong and the temptation to react impulsively is at its peak. That is where the practice happens. That is where the habit forms. That is where the quiet, invisible work of building a stronger mind takes place. And over time, that quiet discipline becomes the foundation of a powerful and resilient mind. Not powerful in the loud, aggressive sense, but powerful in the sense that it can hold steady, that it can endure, that it can maintain clarity in the middle of confusion, that it can choose well in the middle of pressure, that it can remain committed in the absence of immediate reward, that it can face what is difficult without turning away. This kind of strength does not announce itself. It does not need to. It operates quietly, beneath the surface, in the way a person processes their experiences, manages their emotions, and directs their attention through the hours of an ordinary day. And it is available to anyone willing to practice it, not once, not dramatically, but consistently, patiently. One small choice at a time. That is how mental strength is built, and that is how it endures.